Hey,
Hey,
this is
this
Megan with Focus Like a Mother.
is Amy with Creative Catapult Coaching, and apparently I am overly focused on hitting go. I'm practicing for a presentation this week, and we're here with the Control-Alt-Think podcast. I almost said Control-Alt-Delete. This is episode 14, and this is what happens when your executive function is super focused and you're just having a hard time.
Yes, and now I need to fix this because I don't know why it'll. Well, I'm losing my timer, Amy.
That's all right. Um,
Oh,
I'm losing my mind. You're losing your sleep. We're all losing something right now.
yes. So, um, presentations is our topic for today, and we think this is number 14, but we're not absolutely positively sure. Um, so you are getting ready for a presentation. Tell us all about it, Amy.
I'm getting ready to do a presentation with focus.space on executive function, which not surprisingly interrelates to every form of existence, maybe other than sleeping. That being said, I just totally lost my train of thought. So executive function for me is a huge part of why presentations, I've avoided them for a long time. Part of me can do them. Part of me is really frustrated that my short-term memory, I now have a word for understanding why I dread trying to follow a outline, is I can't remember what I intended to say. So I like free-forming, which is part
Mm,
of what this podcast appeals is, I can do all the associations and talking that I want. Doing a presentation though, especially when it's being promoted and the content is being promoted, and I'm working on practicing, I've got a certain number of points I want to hit and a certain time frame to hit it in. And so there is some benefit in practicing, but then I've realized that my brain is, anxious about, am I going to be able to remember what I want to say, which totally impacts my fluidity.
mm,
However, not practicing also means I'm likely to forget what I intend to say.
mm.
So the double-edged sword, coupled with some further past executive function issues coming from, well, brain tumors. And so my whole ability to have the energy, which is kind of related to executive function, but my endurance for doing a presentation. But then also the whole planning and executing of a presentation is a whole different set of executive functions, different than the leading up to and presenting live.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got a lot of executive function around presentation thoughts in my head.
Yes, it sounds like it. Well, and just the executive function skills of being able to plan out and decide. There are so many decisions that go into a presentation. So, I've given quite a few presentations, and it always, doing the presentation is less of a struggle for me as is organizing my thoughts and myself and my material ahead of time for the presentation. So I am notoriously a wing it kind of person that I prefer to present on something I just know really well. Um, but putting together the presentation itself, if I have to have material or slides or whatever to go with it, will take me forever. Um, and I don't really know what it is that I get stuck on, but there are a lot of decisions happening in that whole preparation process. But once I get up to actually present, usually it's not too bad. I'm trying to think the last one I did at the beginning of last month. I prepped ahead of time by kind of reading through all my notes and stuff like that. But yeah, I notoriously wing it for presentations and I always want to practice more, but it's a little bit of that. The procrastination sneaks in, the executive dysfunction of having to make all those decisions or plan or prep things ahead of time sneaks in, and it kind of all piles up into a last minute that neurodivergent surge of adrenaline of, oh, I've got to meet this deadline. And so trying to set myself practice deadlines ahead of time, or when I did earlier this year, I had to give the slides to someone else beforehand.
Mhm.
So I set the artificial deadline of I needed to get the slides to him 2 weeks beforehand, which wasn't something they asked for. That was something that I said, hey, I'm going to get these to you ahead of time. That way, if we need to tweak any of the material or change directions or anything, it's there and we have time. But that was also because I know myself and I know that I'd get stuck and then I wouldn't have time to practice. Whereas if I have to have the material locked down a reasonable time ahead of the actual presentation, then I'm more likely to actually go through and practice or do dry runs, or the the feeling of tweaking and changing things or wanting to tweak and change things sort of goes away, which also hinders the practicing because it's like, oh, I did that, but I need to change this now. Um,
Yeah. Well, it's
so
interesting. I love the adaptation that, we both know aspects of ourselves well enough and we try and both scaffold and support. I tried building a presentation in a totally different way this time. I had the presenter was willing, or the host organization was willing to have a conversation with me, and they drafted the outline based on our 20 or 30-minute conversation, which was really exciting and really cool. So I took a lot of my anxiety and executive dysfunction out of having to move from that verbalization to the written form of the outline, which was really cool. I've also did my first dry run in a way that I'm still kind of amused, a little bit embarrassed at. But I sat down with my virtual assistant, so over the computer, and she just advanced the slides for me. I didn't really have a script, but we'd gone through and filled out all of the different slides, so there was information, and I just kind of talked through it, and we made notes on what was working and what wasn't. And I give the presentation in 3 days, and I need to go back and now actually update my slide deck so I can get it off to the presenters. So I'm trying this in a very different way, but it hasn't felt nearly as intimidating, but my brain is also going, this is not the right way to do it. What are you doing? So it's funny how a lot of these past messages of people legitimately trying to help and teach me a method that works really hasn't worked for me. And my brain is trying really hard to do it the way we've been told is the correct way. And I'm really fighting myself.
well, and just you talking about that made me think about a time when I was in the corporate world and we had to give big presentations. I don't know if it was every quarter or whatever, um, on projects. And we would actually, that collaborative piece of presenting or walking through the presentation um, with someone else so that it doesn't feel like you're just practicing to yourself, but then you also get um, a little bit outside yourself. So a different set of eyes and somebody else's perception of how you phrased things or how the slides are or all of that. So we would start with, in that group, we would start with our slides first, and we would kind of sit down and go through, okay, what's the outline. So that's one of the things. Struggling on your own is different than having someone else give feedback or input. So helping with the outline or giving, knowing what that expectation is. So having a more firm understanding of what's expected for the presentation makes it a lot easier to be able to keep the motivation going around building out the slide deck or putting in what you need to, and then going back for, like you said, more feedback along the way. That's something that's been helpful to me and to others that I've worked with um, in the past in terms of, well, hey, here's this presentation versus now that I am in my own business, if I'm creating courses or presentations for seminars or things like that, it's a lot more vague, which then kind of brings on some more of those indecision struggles or just clarity struggles of well, what is my actual, even simple things, and it's not a presentation, but something that someone in our neighborhood asked me to put together, like some pointers or tips for something about how to do something in your yard. And I'm like, okay, but you have to tell me exactly what you want, right? Same with presentations. Please tell me exactly what you want, and then let me, either you help me with the outline or let me kind of do the rough draft first, and then let me go back to you and make sure that this is still, that what I'm doing is aligned with what the audience wants to hear, versus when it's just me trying to figure stuff out, it takes me a lot longer
Yeah,
to.
well, and it's interesting how I think we both know that, doing it over time, doing repeat iterations, I mean, of a product, but also for me, yeah, I know this one might fall flat. My brain may not work. But the act of actually doing the presentation, if I'm gonna get more visibility and, spend more time doing this kind of thing, really the only way I'm gonna get better is to do it. And
Mhm,
that may mean some of them are not as strong as the others, and that's not necessarily something to aim. Well, there's a point where aiming for mediocrity, so you get the practices, okay, but not saying that just there is something about aim for as good as you can do, but it can't take over your life either.
mhm,
The last major presentation I gave was at a national conference. Um, I worked on it off and on for a year, and it was such a major point of stress that I've avoided presentations for several years. I mean, it was really almost a year of people listening to me agonize over this, and it was an hour presentation. Nothing in my career was writing on it.
mhm,
Um, and yet I just couldn't figure out how to do it. The presentation, I think, was fine. It had a lot of information. It probably had too much information, but it was well received. But it was such a mental and emotional cost that that presentation got written at that it's just doesn't, it's made me really avoid presentations, and yet at the other end, when I freeform it, it's maybe interesting, but who knows if there's actually content or organization or depth that anyone else can follow.
mhm. Yeah, it's sort of a balance between stressing over it and kind of getting all the details in there versus trusting yourself, and that sort of, mine is winging it and yours is sort of more free forming, but it's the same thing of how much how much structure and planning ahead do I need versus how much can I trust myself in the moment and follow along. Some of the things I've been taught, I've done so many presentation skills things, right? So I have a master's in business. Part of the program was uh an entire course on presenting, because presenting to the C-suite is an art form. But one of the things I've learned is especially with like executives, but everyone in general, has their own things they've learned as an audience member, someone listening to a presentation, things they've learned, um, preferences. I've met some very curmudgeons that just like are very particular about what has to be on the slide versus what you say and all of these things. So I try not to get caught up in that, knowing that I just need to trust my own self and my own style. Um, and some of the things that I've learned have been contradictory. So I was just listening to a book, and I cannot think of the name of it right now, but they were talking about public speaking. And they actually referenced something I've learned in the past, which is tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them again. And this person said, well, if you're public speaking, they know what you're going to tell them because they came to the presentation. So you don't have to start off by telling them what you're going to tell them. You want to start off by kind of using a hook or some really engaging something to start your presentation so that they know, like, hey, this isn't going to be like a super boring lecture on something. But that just sort of blew my mind because I was going, well, okay, now it makes sense because I've had other times where I've learned something about either communication styles in terms of writing or presentation styles,
Right.
and they're contradictory. So it really
Well, I
comes
don't
back down
actually
to
see
trusting
that one as
yourself.
contradictory. I see that as you start with the hook and then you go into the tone, what you're going to tell them.
Yeah, it's just I've just learned so many different things over the years, and some of it even in coach training and courses for
Uh-huh.
coaching, there is um kind of proper forms and etiquettes and sort of for us it's our competencies for coaching that we have to follow, and then there's style. So doing it the right way and doing it your way are kind of two different um aspects that you have to look at it, and it's the same for presenting and public speaking. Is like everybody's presentation style is different, and yeah, there are things that you should really do, um but like you said, free forming or winging it, I know some people have to get up there with index cards, and that's the way they go about it. So everybody's just so different. Um, but it's interesting how the executive function kind of comes into it, especially like I said, for me, it's all the decisions and then not second guessing the
Yeah, that
decisions once they've been made.
prioritizing and planning and decision making and sequencing and
Mhm.
self-management to get the presentation written. And that's before we even get up there and start talking and have to rely on short-term memory, the ability to be flexible in our thinking at the moment because the audience didn't react the way you expected, or
Mhm.
you completely forgot what you were going to say. And so, how do you have enough composure and flexibility to recover and start again? Or even if you are flustered, then, the self-management to be able to go. And I love this one that my VA said is my big good one. If my brain goes and completely decides to not recall any information, that, yeah, I've given this presentation 4 or 5 times and today it's not going so well. Welcome to executive function in action.
Mhm.
And so it's like, especially because this presentation is about executive function, I can point to my own self in
Mhm.
relation to any of it. Um, and it's a subject I know, so it's like part of me could totally freeform probably for 45 minutes to an hour. It might get a little repetitive, but I know
Mhm.
a lot about this stuff. So it's like in some ways the practicing is harder
Mhm.
because like, well, I know it, but using highlighting and figuring out specific examples to get across the point, my brain's like, I don't even know exactly what point I want to get across. I mean, other than working memory is important.
Mhm.
Working memory, the ability to hold information in your brain, and then the application of, okay, you get the PIN code. Can you remember as you're doing two-factor authentication, can you hold that 6-digit thing in your brain long enough to type it into your computer from your
Yeah.
phone?
Yeah.
And when I first gave that example, it's like the coordinator who was doing the interview, she just shuddered. And so it was a very visceral, it really landed. And so it's like, okay, that's a really good example. I'm not very good at coming up with examples in the moment, other than those random points where I hit on gold.
Mhm.
People are like, be specific. And I'm like,
Got to think
specific
about it.
are
Yeah.
not always my strong suit and never have been. And again, practice, but being put on the spot in the moment is like, it's like deer in the headlights.
Well, and there is also something to say beyond the working memory piece is also the overwhelm that goes with it, whether it's anxiety, whether it's sensory overload, whether it's just too many things that your brain has to monitor, or there's too many things you're trying to take in. Um, so you mentioned practicing and leading up to the presentation, and then in the presentation, trying to recall all of the things. So for me, I structure my slides a certain way so that that sort of helps me, that I use the slides as a tool to make sure that I
Uh-huh.
stay on track and I know about how long I should spend on each slide, so that I tend to ramble and go over. But the other thing is standing up in front of a group of people or in front of a screen that's going to a group of people, um, you're also monitoring so many things. So, like, am I looking around the room enough? Am I making good eye contact? Eye contact can be super overwhelming for neurodivergent people. Um, then it's also, am I standing up straight? Am I not slouching? Am I fidgeting? Like, is it okay to have a fidget? My presentation last month, one of the presenters actually had a squish ball fidget to hold on to while they were presenting. So it just depends on knowing your audience, but also knowing yourself of like, all of these things are going to be coming into, and my brain has to filter out all of this information, and I have to remember what I was going to say.
Yep.
So
And so there
it's
is
a lot.
something in practice. And, I was excited when I learned there will be somebody else monitoring, both advancing the slides and monitoring the chat in the room and then bringing up questions at the end. So it's like for me, once I clarified the logistics, my brain also, could create a imaginary scenario and fill in a lot of unknowns. Is it going to look like that? Probably not. But for years I've known as long as my brain can come up with some sort of semi-likely scenario, I can move forward, even knowing that it's not going to look like that. It's not going to act like that.
Mhm.
Years ago, I did a stage management gig where I had to, coordinate all of these presenters across 2 stages and, kind of be the wrangler for all the speakers and, and it was just like, complete overwhelm. And it's like, once I realized that I was scared of not knowing what was coming, I wrote up a fake agenda for what was going to happen or what could happen. And then I was fine. Did it look
Mm,
like my fake agenda? Not at all. But suddenly giving my brain some form of something to work with
mhm.
helped immensely.
It, yeah, just at least letting your brain process through, like, these are the things that could happen, and this is what I'm going to do about it. So then you're not worrying about it anymore. It's taken care of. The thing we've talked about quite a bit since the beginning of this, because we're getting close to the end of our time, is practice. So you mentioned practicing for your presentation. I mentioned that ideally I'd like to practice. One of the things that's come up for me recently, it was towards the beginning of this month, somebody at our networking, one of our local networking groups mentioned a local Toastmasters group. And I had the thought of, oh, hey, I've heard about Toastmasters many, many times over the years, and I've never taken the opportunity to go join a Toastmasters
Mhm.
group. That if I really do want to start presenting more or speaking more, I kind of wondered in the back of my head, like, oh, should I go ahead and follow through and do that and join something like Toastmasters where I'm having to practice presenting, but there's not like anything major on the line. It's truly
Right.
practice. Um, that's one of the things that I've considered. Have you considered any other like low risk ways of being more comfortable with presenting?
Practicing with organizations, where they're finding some of the audience because I have my own anxieties over other aspects of things. I did Toastmasters years ago and it was useful, but I'm not sure that I've got any other current low stakes thoughts other than, booking, finding opportunities to continue to do this.
Mm,
Um, with organizations, and potentially giving the same speech several times, which people have been after me to do for a long time. Well,
hmm
why do you keep writing new ones? Well, okay, I have a grand total of 3 at this point I could pull from. So it's not exactly like there's a large repertoire. Um, I may be practicing tomorrow with my sister who does a ton of presenting for work and training for her company and team. So, and she and I think very, very similarly. So I think doing, for me, low stakes work is practicing with her, because she's done this for years and does, weekly trainings for the company for 8 years. I mean, so it's just kind of a no-brainer, but listening to her ideas of what worked for her, I think there's space for me to adopt pieces
Okay.
of what she does. Albeit that may not work for everybody because you may not have a sister who works at a national transportation level, but that's fine.
Yeah. Well, we are close to the end of our time. What other thoughts do you have on presentations? I know hopefully your one this week goes really well.
Thank you. I think it will. And I had thought and my executive function lost it, or my working memory lost it. So, if I can just, relax and sleep as much as reasonable and generally take care of myself, I'm gonna go in and get some practice. And nobody else knows what I'm intending to say, so as long as I can use the slides as a general outline, I should be fine. I know enough to know what I'm talking about, and I tend to cause myself anxiety over a lot of stuff.
All right. Well, I don't have any major presentations coming up, although I would love to get regular webinars going again for my businesses. So for me, that's also a fairly low stakes presentation opportunity. So, but I never know when. Actually, I guess yeah, I never know when like networking presentation opportunities come up, and those are usually like 15 or 20-minute um, deals. So yeah, it's just interesting as long as there's a good solid deadline and I can give myself a solid fake deadline beforehand, I'm
You're
on the
good to
right
go.
track.
Well, I
So
guess, and yeah, the other thing in closing is, in some ways, doing this and talking about things that have parallels to my business on a weekly basis is a kind of practice. It's a very low stakes, but it's a fluidity practice and a how do I show up on camera practice. And so, it's a enjoyable space for me to practice without literally any stakes or any particular outcome we're trying to hit.
yeah, yep. Well, I think that's a good spot to wrap up on. And so I suppose I'll take us out. This is Megan with Focus Like a Mother.
And Amy with Creative Catapult Coaching. And this is the Control-Alt-Think podcast, episode 14, we believe.
And we'll see everybody next time. Bye.
Take care.